Moundsville Penitentiary, a Gothic fortress built in 1876, was designed to house the worst of the worst. With its towering stone walls and razor wire, it was a place where hope came to die, and for many, it did. The prison was a self-contained world of misery, where men were sent to pay for their crimes but often found themselves facing horrors far beyond what they had imagined. The prison was divided into two main sections: North Hall, which housed the most dangerous and violent offenders, and South Hall, which held the general population. North Hall was a place of fear, even among the inmates. The men who lived there were often isolated, their cells cold and damp, with nothing but the sounds of the insane and the damned to keep them company. Among the many who suffered in North Hall was a man named Raymond "Red" Dugan. Red was a towering figure, a career criminal who had been convicted of multiple murders. He was feared by both the guards and the inmates, a man who had nothing left to lose. But even Red was not immune to the horrors of Moundsville. Red had been in North Hall for less than a year when he began to experience strange occurrences. At first, it was just the sounds, whispers that seemed to come from the walls, footsteps in the dead of night when no one was around. He tried to ignore them, attributing them to the madness of the prison. But soon, the whispers became voices, and the footsteps became the sound of chains dragging across the stone floor. Red wasn't the only one to notice. Other inmates began to speak of strange figures seen at the end of darkened corridors, shadowy shapes that disappeared as soon as they were spotted. Some said the prison was cursed, that the souls of those who had been executed there lingered, seeking revenge on the living. One night, Red awoke to find his cell door open, something that should have been impossible. Cautiously, he stepped out into the hallway, expecting to see a guard or another inmate. Instead, he was greeted by a cold, empty corridor. The whispers began again, louder this time, coming from every direction. "Red. Red, you can't escape us." Panicked, Red ran down the corridor, but no matter which way he turned, he found himself back at his cell. The whispers grew louder, the voices angry and accusing. "You deserve this, you deserve to die here." When the guards found Red the next morning, he was huddled in the corner of his cell, muttering to himself. His once fierce demeanor had been replaced by sheer terror. He refused to speak of what had happened, and within days, he was dead, found hanging in his cell, his eyes wide open, as if he had seen something that had driven him to the edge of madness. Red was not the only one. Over the next few years, more inmates met mysterious ends, suicides, unexplained deaths, men found dead in their cells with expressions of horror etched on their faces. The guards whispered about a curse, a dark force that had taken hold of the prison. Even the most hardened among them began to fear the night shifts, claiming they could hear the voices of the damned, feel cold hands brushing against them as they walked the halls. The prison's execution chamber, located near the North Wagon Gate, became the epicenter of the hauntings. The electric chair, known as Old Sparky, had claimed the lives of dozens of men, and it was said that their spirits were trapped in the very walls of the chamber. Guards reported seeing the chair move on its own, hearing the cries of the condemned long after they had been executed. One guard, a man named Tom Hughes, had been working at Moundsville for nearly 2 decades when he had his encounter. It was late one night, and Tom was patrolling the area near the execution chamber when he heard the faint sound of someone sobbing. Following the sound, he arrived at the chamber, only to find it empty. But the sobbing continued, echoing off the cold stone walls. As Tom turned to leave, he saw it, a figure seated in Old Sparky, a man whose face was hidden in shadow. The figure slowly lifted its head, revealing a pair of glowing eyes that stared directly at Tom. Frozen in fear, Tom could only watch as the figure spoke in a voice that was both human and inhuman, "We will never leave." Tom ran from the chamber, never to return. He quit the next day, unable to shake the feeling that something had followed him home. He wasn't alone, other guards began to leave as well, refusing to work in a place where the line between the living and the dead had blurred beyond recognition. By the early 1990s, the prison was in a state of disrepair. Overcrowding, violence, and the relentless hauntings had taken their toll. Inmates were rioting, the staff was leaving in droves, and the state could no longer ignore the mounting pressure to close the prison. In 1995, Moundsville Penitentiary was finally shut down. The last inmates were transferred to other facilities, and the gates were closed for good. But even as the prison emptied, the spirits remained. The locals believed that the souls of those who had died there, both the executed and the tormented, were trapped, forever bound to the place of their suffering. Today, Moundsville Penitentiary stands as a relic of the past, its once bustling halls are now silent. But those who visit say the prison is far from empty. They speak of shadowy figures that move through the darkness, voices that call out from the cells, and a cold, oppressive presence that lingers in the air. By the time the prison closed in 1995, it had earned a reputation not just for its brutality but for the dark entities that were said to haunt its halls. The locals called it hell on earth, and the brave few who dared to enter spoke of shadows that moved on their own, disembodied whispers, and the feeling of being watched by something not of this world. But there was one part of the prison that was feared above all, the North Wagon Gate, where prisoners were once led to their deaths. The gallows had long since been removed, but the darkness that lingered there was palpable. They said that the spirits of the men who had met their end at the end of a rope still wandered the grounds, seeking revenge on the living. One cold October night, a group of paranormal investigators arrived at the prison, hoping to document the hauntings for their television show. They were led by Jackson Reed, a seasoned investigator who had spent years chasing ghosts but had never found anything that truly terrified him. He had heard the stories about Moundsville but dismissed them as just that, stories. The group entered the prison through the main gate, their flashlights cutting through the thick darkness. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, as if the walls themselves were alive and pressing in on them. As they moved deeper into the prison, the temperature dropped, and the silence became deafening. They set up their equipment in various parts of the prison, infrared cameras, EVP recorders, motion detectors, but it was at the North Wagon Gate where Jackson decided to conduct a solo session. He had heard that this was the most haunted part of the prison, and he wanted to experience it firsthand. As he sat down in the middle of the room, the gallows once stood, Jackson turned on his recorder and began asking questions. "Is there anyone here with me?" The room remained silent, the only sound being the faint hum of the recorder. Jackson waited for a few moments before asking another question. "Did you die here?" Again, silence. Jackson was about to ask another question when he heard it, a faint rustling sound, like footsteps shuffling across the floor. He pointed his flashlight toward the source of the sound, but there was nothing there. He swallowed hard, trying to maintain his composure. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice echoing off the walls. This time, the response was immediate. A loud bang reverberated through the room as if something heavy had fallen or been thrown. Jackson jumped to his feet, shining his flashlight frantically around the room, but there was nothing out of place. Suddenly, the temperature dropped even further, and Jackson could see his breath in the air. He felt a cold breeze brush past him, and then he heard it, a voice, low and guttural, whispering in his ear. "You shouldn't be here." Jackson spun around, but no one was there. His heart pounded in his chest, and he could feel the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The air around him grew thicker, and the shadows in the room seemed to move on their own, creeping closer to him. "I just want to know who you are," Jackson said, trying to keep his voice steady. For a moment, there was silence, and then the voice came again, louder this time. "Leave." Jackson stumbled backward, his flashlight flickering. He fumbled for his recorder, but it slipped from his hand and clattered to the floor. The shadows in the room began to take shape, forming figures that were barely distinguishable from the darkness itself. He could see them now, dozens of shadowy figures, their faces twisted in pain and rage. They moved slowly toward him, their eyes glowing with a faint, eerie light. Jackson's breath caught in his throat as the figures closed in, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. "Leave! Leave! Leave!" Jackson turned and ran, his footsteps echoing through the prison as he fled down the dark corridors. The whispers followed him, growing louder and more frantic as he raced toward the exit. The shadows seemed to close in around him, their cold hands reaching out, trying to pull him back into the darkness. He could see the exit now, the faint glow of the outside world just ahead. With one final burst of energy, Jackson lunged for the door, bursting through it and out into the cold night air. He collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath, his heart pounding in his chest. The other investigators found him a few moments later, pale and shaking, unable to speak. When they reviewed the footage from his session, they found the recording filled with strange noises, static, disembodied voices, and, at the end, the sound of a man screaming. Jackson never returned to Moundsville, and the episode they filmed was never aired. The prison remained as it always had, dark, cold, and haunted by the souls of the damned. To this day, no one knows what Jackson saw that night. Some say it was just his imagination, playing tricks on him in the darkness. But those who know the history of Moundsville Penitentiary believe otherwise. They say the spirits of the prisoners who died there, the ones who met their end at the gallows, are still trapped within its walls, waiting for someone to join them in their eternal torment. And if you listen closely on a cold October night, you might just hear their whispers too.